Okay, one more video for this lesson, which is we are still in lesson 3. We talked about value returning functions. Now we are going to talk very quickly about data validation. How would we validate data and what does it do? So here is code. I'm going to open it in Replit and we're going to fork it again. So we can actually take a look at it in my account. And what is data validation? Data validation or input validation is when user enters a number, we are trying to see if they entered a valid input, right? So for example, we are getting a number from the user. We want to say enter age and they enter ABC. How do you know ABC is obviously not a good age and we have to validate that data? So that's what we're trying to do here. So as we talk about functions, we are trying to see why would we want to write functions, when would we want it to return values, when do we not want it to return values, right? How do we decide all these things? So this function here, or this program here has two functions. We have one called main and one called get valid input. So on line 25, I'm going to step through this code so we know what it does. On line 25, we call main. So control comes to line 1, goes into main, and we have on line 4, num equals get valid input. That's a function. Get valid input is a function which is right here on line 12. So we jump to get valid input. Get valid input, notice, has empty parenthesis. That means it is not taking anything, but it is returning something because whatever it gets returned or whatever it gets back is getting put into num, right? So we know the function is returning something. So let's go to the function and see what it does. We have a variable called valid, which is set to false, which is a Boolean variable. We just know that because we've set it to false. And we check here, while not valid, that means while valid is not true, or in other words, it's saying while valid is false. That's what this whole thing is saying. We go in here and valid is set to false. So we are going to go in here and we say try. The try is a syntax where we're going to try this and these two statements. That's what that's saying. We're going to try, actually we're going to try statement number 17. We are going to ask the user to enter an integer. It's going to do this, and then we're going to try to convert it to an int. Okay, now if the user enters a good integer, then valid is set to true, and it is going to skip over this, and it is going to go back to the while. And valid will be true, so not valid will be false, which means this whole thing, condition will be false, and it's going to come out of there because that's what that sets the valid to be. Okay, now if they don't enter a good integer, if they enter ABC, then this conversion is going to fail. When that fails, it is going to skip over this valid because it tried to do that. Obviously, it failed because they entered a character. It's going to come to except on line 19. It's going to print not an integer. Notice it skipped over the statement, so valid is still false. So it's going to go right back to the while loop. Valid is still false. It goes back into the loop and it tries again. And it's going to come to line 17 and wait for the user to enter an integer. And as long as the user is entering bad characters, it's always going to skip over this valid, come over here, say it's not an integer, and go back to the while loop. When the user enters a good number, it is going to essentially set valid equals true, come out of the loop. When it comes out of the loop, what are we doing? We are returning the good number. And that goes right back here to line 4 and gets put into number or num and gets printed. So you could use this validation when you are reading any input from the user. If you're reading an input from the user, which is again a number, then you could simply take this piece of code and change the prompt. Notice it says enter integer. This num contains 23. And it says enter integer again because we call get valid input over again. So 56. And it says function returns 56. So this is an example to show you that you could call get valid input as we have on line 4 Whatever comes back goes into num, and we store it, and it says num contains this number. And then we have another statement here where in the print statement directly, we have called the function. Notice we are not storing it into num. That's why it says enter integer again. So let's comment this out for a second to see how this works. So if we don't have that statement, it says enter integer, that's coming from statement 4, where we call the get valid input, comes here, it says enter integer. Now let's try something bad. A, it says not an integer, and it keeps telling us as long as we do A, B, C, D, whatever, it's going to keep saying that's bad. So when we enter a good number, it says num contains 9 and a blank line, and it's done. Now if I uncomment this line, what's going to happen after the blank line? It's going to jump to line 10. It's going to come here to the function call the function, does all of the stuff. When return number happens, it comes here, number gets put in this pot, and it gets printed because that function call is part of that print statement. So a couple of different ways to call the same function. That's what that's showing you.